All right, thank you for being here, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here today. So welcome to our Carbon Solutions webinar series, where we highlight what we're doing with our company and our partners. I'm Rachel Esch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for Carbon Solutions, and excited to have each of you here today. Our presenters today will be Jessi, Eidbo, and Erin Middleton, who will explore strategies for engaging communities in direct air capture projects. They'll discuss best practices for federal projects and offer some engagement strategies for those listening today. Please note this meeting is being recorded. You can view this presentation along with our other recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. In addition, if you're viewing the webinar, we're excited to add you to our newsletter mailing list. We want this to be a conversation, so please share your thoughts, your questions, experiences in the chat, and we will address those at the end of the webinar. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to pass this over to our presenters.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. You can see from our title slide and Rachel's introduction, we're going to be talking about community engagement, especially for direct air capture. Next slide, please, Jessi. A little bit about Carbon Solutions for those of you who may not know about us. Our mission and vision are on this page. We are really looking for solutions for a net zero carbon economy. We are especially interested in bringing the science and research into applied projects. About half of us have PhDs in a variety of things. We have planners, sociologists, we have economists, engineers, chemists, geographers, geologists, and what we try to do is have a small but mighty team that is able to look at many different projects aspects in DAC or CCS or other net zero carbon solutions in order to, again, bring these the research and best practices to real world applications. Next slide, please. A little bit about me. My name is Erin Middleton. I have a background in geology and geography, and I have really worked at the intersection of quantitative data and qualitative data. That's what a survey tells you and how people actually mean what they're saying when you talk to them, especially as this goes into deploying projects. Jessi Eidbo will introduce herself in just 1 second after I give the agenda for today. Next slide, please. So what are we going to talk a little bit about? One thing is, what is community engagement and what are we talking about? Community engagement is both a thing of itself, and then it's also a thing that is in a lot of federal projects. So figuring out how to work in both the federal space and community engagement space, especially for an emerging technology, is what we're going to be talking about. How we have really thought about custom engagement strategies in some of the projects we're being awarded, what we think are best practices in sort of a practical sense, and how we see this working in proposals and projects as they're going forward. What's immediately important right now, especially for anybody who's going to be anticipating doing funding in the next 6 months, and next steps. What should you be thinking about now if you are a CDR technology developer? I'm going to pass it over to Jessi to introduce herself and get us kicked off.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin, and happy to meet everyone. I'm very excited to have you on this conversation today. My name is Jessi Eidbo. As Erin mentioned, I'm one of the staff at Carbon Solutions who hold the planner title or wear the planner hat. A lot of my career has been spent across the nonprofit and local government community space, working on climate action strategies, planning and deployment, and that's taken many forms. But here at Carbon Solutions, I'm very energized to be able to work on a lot of the CDR and emergent technologies and apply the practices from that work to this. So to kick things off, as Erin mentioned, taking a step back to acknowledge that community engagement is many things, and how folks come to this space or come to this practice, often the journeys that they traverse look very different. And so we wanted to carve out an opportunity to describe what we think about when we think about community. And so again, an acknowledgement that there is an enormous body of scholarship and theory, best practices from a lot of different sources that define what engagement is or give guidance on best practices. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're taking the approach that community is and can apply to any set of stakeholders. It's often defined by things like common geography or relationship to place, but we want to recognize that it can also be defined by any set of organizing principles or shared commonalities among a group of people. So in practice, it's going to look really different depending on what your objective is, right? And so you can see this sort of loose diagram at right shows how there are a lot of different nested identities that community members and stakeholders will hold. That tie to one another, can exist inherent to themselves, are going to inform one another, starting with the hyperlocal in the sense of place that people hold, the geography that you are in, then moving into things like practice, your community of affiliation, which may be religious or cultural, moving up to even broader cultural, national, or political identities to our global citizenry. So there's this very broad spectrum of ways and things that can inform identity. And I will not profess to be, an expert on that scholarship, but this starts to give you a flavor. And if anyone on the webinar is so enticed, there is a lot to dive into. I think the reason we're excited to give that context is because as we think through all of those kind of ephemeral ways to acknowledge community, we hope to bring those things better into applied practice. And so one of the ways that we think about stakeholders, specifically our community members, is how do the various tiers of or hierarchy of community or social identity inform what type of stakeholder you might be thinking about as you approach a project. So here we've given some examples. When you're thinking about community of place, what's relevant to the fact that there's a shared geography? If looking to cite a CDR project, maybe thinking about landowners in your project radius, right? The fact that they are inherently close to where you want to site is very important. Local elected officials are going to hold regulatory authority over some permitting decisions, but you may be in a different space or phase of engagement, and we'll talk about that in a second, where you're thinking higher level, that you may not have a site and the stakeholders relevant to your project may be affiliated more with a community of practice, like industry stakeholders or energy stakeholders specific to your technology, or for DAC, the DAC community. And then you may be even higher level, right? When we think about affiliation, there's relationships and dynamics associated with climate advocacy, tech investors, the list goes on and on. But it helps to think of the way that we define stakeholders as potentially tied to these types of tiers in defining community. And to drive that point home, underscoring that the relevance of these tiers are going to be determined by many factors in your engagement strategy. And so a couple high-level ones that you or may be relevant to ask yourself are, what is your TRL level? How ready is your technology to go to market or to become commercial? And the need to remember that the tier of the community may inform readiness for social stakeholders or the stakeholders you hope to engage in the exact same way that the readiness of your technology to go to market should be mirrored. So if you have a very nascent technology, right, you're not trying to do extraordinarily in-depth high-level engagement per se. That's one example. The other is the sort of high-low company profile that you want to hold. Are you looking to be super public about the type of development that you're doing or the development that you're engaging in? Are you trying to be a champion or a leader in the technology? Or are you looking to be more behind the scenes and let the market carry you and you'd like to operate? There's no right or wrong answer to these questions, but they are the types of proactive questions that can help inform your engagement strategy well before you have any conversations with anybody. And third is attachment to place. So how bound to a location is your project? One thing that and Erin will talk about a little bit more later on is how much easier it is to think about an engagement strategy or cultivate your engagement strategy when you know the place that you want to operate in. So do you already have a development site? Are you still scoping? The ease and also the approach will look very different depending on where you are there. And finally, the last slide about sort of this practice or theory piece is just making a distinction between engagement and outreach. So again, the definition for engagement can be many things. Here we're talking about engagement as a two-way dialogue. This is consistent with the way that the US federal government has been talking about engagement. It is not transactive, it is a relationship, whereas outreach can look more one way. So to underscore that, when we think about engagement, I think it's helpful to think about it less as a model and more about a framework. And there are guiding principles, strategies, and approaches that fall within that can help cultivate the type of meaningful relationship that's going to make a project successful and make your engagement strategy successful. Both have a role in project development, though, and I think that's really important to think about. Outreach is we can define as a bit shorter term. It may look like the marketing or the informational outreach you do to provide education or materials, but you're not necessarily looking for input. You're not necessarily looking to have conversation about it. And there are often requirements for many things, not just federal projects, right, that outreach does satisfy that isn't engagement. And so there may be, this is not prescriptive, but there may be instances where you're not seeking to do or have engagement for a broad number of reasons. Your technology isn't ready yet. You don't know if you're going to be in that location, right, where outreach may make more sense, but they are not one and the same. But a final note on this, right, is that outreach can be a component of engagement, and engagement often does need a component of outreach to provide some level setting. So there's nuance. It's a little bit sticky. I recognize that wasn't like a beautiful binary, but we hear and see and fall prey to it myself, often using the two interchangeably, and there are important distinctions there. But why are we talking about this today? There are a lot of reasons. I could talk about the passion that I feel for it, but I think what's more important are underscoring 4 things that I think and hope are relevant to the folks on this call. So we know, and with CDR in particular, there's a lot of urgency for all industry players to act in good faith. There are a lot of moving dynamic parts to this technology, and CDR technology is commercializing, and there is value to everyone to continue to foster trust and help pave the way for future development. We often say anecdotally that bad engagement can be worse than no engagement, which neither are good, right? But if one industry player moves forward and operates not in bad faith, and it may not be intentional, right? But it can undermine the ability of other projects to develop, because word of mouth is potent, and we have social media, and we all sort of in this time are beholden to each other to ensure that we're doing this with a high moral standard. The second is really tangible. There are just now, and over the last couple of years, emergent and evolving requirements associated with the numerous federal funding opportunities that demand incorporation of community labor stakeholder engagement. If you are pursuing any of this funding, and Erin will talk about this, you need to have a handle on your engagement strategy, because it will be part of the package that you submit for the funding opportunity. The third is similar to the first, right? But there are a lot of ethical questions about how, and it's exciting that this is coming to the fore in our national dialogue around technology commercialization and energy action as we pursue a net zero economy and decarbonization goals. We have made progress towards identifying what it means to deploy technology considerate of things like social and environmental justice. And those are also baked into a lot of the federal project requirements for folks applying to projects. But it also raises questions for industry players on what this conversation is going to need for their development, and how they want to integrate considerations of environmental justice or social justice, and using their project maybe in creative ways to advance tandem or parallel goals around these issues, especially as we think about things like community health and well-being. And the fourth and final is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And so having these types of conversations helps build expertise to ensure that mutual success are in place for projects and places. It ties back to the first one, right, that we all sort of want to make sure that we're supporting each other, and to the extent that we can, to continue to foster success in this industry. But we're also often sort of fumbling in the dark. So if we can do that together, we are hopeful to see broader success. The next section, I think, also ties to those 4 imperatives or reasons why we're talking about this. We know that there are climate goals that we need to achieve, and the IPCC reports and International Panel on Climate Change reports that have come out in the past couple of years acknowledge that adoption at scale and pretty extensive magnitude of CDR technologies is going to be absolutely crucial to achieving climate goals. So the goal really is project deployment, right? To get there, however, there are a couple of foundational pieces that we need. Obviously, a suitable location. You need project financing. engineering and other necessary conditions like sufficient power to move your project forward or to operate your project. These are all things that the industry players are getting a pretty good handle on. Developers have done work to advance engineering and understand the necessary power conditions. We have a handle on where we have good access to renewable energy, and the unlocking federal financing through the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act have been monumental in helping commercialize. We're also gaining understanding as to where these projects are likely to be able to operate well on a technological front. But there's this lingering piece, right? And it's social license and community support. So in understanding that we need to move these forward, and we've seen this with other energy decarbonization and climate technology solutions, community support, which others may call it social acceptance or social license, is a key piece to the overall puzzle of successful technology deployment. You can have a DAC facility that operates with crazy efficiency and a streamlined route, but if you are trying to site that in a community that does not want that, your project is not likely to move forward. And that's true not just for DAC, right, but other technology solutions as well. I call upon what we refer to as the tales of caution. I guess maybe it's just I refer to it. This is maybe not sanctioned, but from wind and solar, and be it caution or otherwise. I think what we have seen happen with energy technology development as early as the early aughts is so illustrative and something that CDR and emergent technology solutions can learn from in a really, really meaningful way. I think it's also relevant because we understand that green or carbon neutral DAC, by most accounting, is going to require siting proximal to where you have good renewable energy potential. So the ability to co-locate and site additional infrastructure to support the energy demands of the project are not going to be irrelevant. If we travel back in time, looking at the early 2000s and early 2010s, wind and solar became economically competitive with traditional forms of and conventional forms of energy generation. So we were looking at coal and natural gas. That was really attractive to the development community. And so we had a boon in wind and solar industry developers who went out and were procuring land leases. And the second box, communities were variably consulted throughout that process. We saw tremendous build out, which was fantastic, occurring at unprecedented scope and scale. The issue emerged in the third box, where the variable community consultation started to trigger a little bit of antagonism, and that was often organized. It was often leveraging local land use controls, and it got to the point where we saw, pretty wide scale use of local land use authority to ban, to prohibit, restrict to development of renewable energies, irrespective of whether a developer had already procured land leases, et cetera. And I think here is where, so then moving through that policy landscape change, developers in the wind and solar industry, in many instances, are now having to backtrack to regain or establish trust, or to overcome prohibitive local land use policies, increasing both project costs and reducing the likelihood of project success. And obviously, we are still seeing these types of projects move forward. It's just in a relatively complex environment compared to what we saw 20 years ago. And I think that lesson, or tale of caution, is something that this industry, and DAC specifically, but also CDR, is in a really advantageous place to avoid by having meaningful consultation and conversation and dialogue and various degrees of outreach and engagement with communities while in advance to achieve what we saw on the earlier slide, the social license to navigate sustained support for the technology as it's deployed. So how do you achieve social license? There are preconditions, but there's also no silver bullet, and I'll say that up front, despite the words that I put on the slide, or the number of words I put on the slide. I think here what's really key to remember is that you're not starting with a blank canvas. So anytime that a developer, a DAC or CDR technology developer, moves or goes into a community, there's precedent, there's history, there's context, and those communities are going to vary tremendously in a lot of different dimensions. So the understanding that they have of the technology, information they may have already been exposed to with regard to the technology, their willingness to learn about it, folks are busy, as well as appetite to engage if there are projects moving forward. Ability to engage is also a big one, right? Time is money. Time is also finite. And then their perspectives on things like climate change, why the technology is here to begin with. I started with a statement about the IPCC not everyone reads that or cares about that. And all of those things are going to color the method, the strategy, tactics, timing, and medium and format of what a successful strategy or for operation engagement looks like for your company. And at the same time, as we discussed with wind and solar, a history of development in the community is going to inform the pre-existing conditions that the DAC project or their CDR project faces. And it's a very, very delicate and exciting and opportunity filled but dynamic space that developers are now operating in, to engage in conversation about how projects can serve community, but also acknowledging and being mindful that right of refusal or the ability of communities to prevent development is still very real. And so now that I have spoken for some time, and hopefully given folks a pretty high level understanding, I'll hand it over to Erin to talk about why we care about this right now.
Thanks, Jessi. So why is this relevant? Next slide, please. As many folks are familiar with these 4 interrelated tasks for what makes up community benefits plans: diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, Justice 40, community stakeholder and labor engagement, quality jobs and workforce development. Each one of these are 4 components of something that is usually called a community benefits plan that are required for a variety of projects. Many of you know that these things are required for federal projects. They can take different flavors or slightly different requirements depending on where you are in the project, whether you're writing a proposal or whether it's been awarded. Occasionally there's new formats that these are required to be put into, but these are also relevant for small business innovation research grants. Our company applies to many of these. There are new ways that this is sort of being packaged to have these. In addition, the carbon credit markets often have a requirement for companies to think about this in some way. So while it's true that these are required for federal governments, there are, lots of different ways that it's important for people to think about these. I'm not going to belabor what each one of these sections are, but I guess I would say that for me, one of the things that is a tricky part from the proposal writing perspective is that almost each one of these is a different form of community engagement. Some of these are very outreach based. For example, advertising information about your jobs to quality jobs may look like outreach as opposed to engagement. But as you have more jobs to offer or are employing more people, it may actually look like a pretty solid engagement strategy to, for example, open up the capacity of an engineering college or an associate's degree for training folks to do a technology or training folks in a technology that isn't available yet. So in each one of these, there's kind of different times when you think about them, but each one of them needs a different set of stakeholders and a different engagement strategy in order to satisfy all 4 of these components. Next slide, please. There's a little bit of history of this. We will share our slides later, so if anybody wants to look back, they can revisit this. But really, for the last 3 years, we've been operating in a space where community benefits plans are really important. And again, we've seen this start with the federal proposals, but then go into several other areas. For those of you who are in New York State or California, this is not new. Your states kind of started this, and now it is being applied to everyone in different ways, depending on your own state or with federal government requirements. And so different people have comfort levels with operating with environmental justice communities, with disadvantaged communities, with labor. But really, some of the things that the federal government do is make applicable to all states some of the things that some of the states were already doing. And so I'm mentioning this partly because we have these 3 years of federal projects, but there's really a lot of diverse experiences and rich experience with people already doing community benefits agreements or some form of them. So again, it's new in some states, but it is helpful to reach out to project partners as you're pulling these things together, because certain people have already had a rich experience in building these things out and delivering them, even if they weren't necessarily called a DEIA plan. So as you're thinking about these projects, again, it's helpful to cast a wider net of what these things mean, looking at solar, looking at wind, looking at other planning and siting, because this is new to energy, but not necessarily new to these kinds of projects. Next slide, please. So just for a little bit of why you should care, Jessi has mentioned a whole bunch of different reasons that are important, but the federal government, in my view, is really helping people think about engagement in a space where they were more worried about technical feasibility. And it's an uncomfortable space to have to think about delivering project benefits before you feel like you're ready. But the idea of thinking about what a Justice 40 community is, what a disadvantaged community is, where is a tribal community, how is this located near my project site, is a fundamental shift in how people are thinking about developing technology. And for me, not quoting anybody else's goals, I think that this is a really important thing, that we are at the very beginning of a project thinking, how could this be successful to the most number of people? What communities are already distressed, and where should we be concerned about them? And what are some of these pain points? Is it water? Is it economics? Is it transportation? Is it pollution? How can we start thinking of these things? So what the slide is also trying to show is that these things are important, and this is part of why we're trying to change this. How can we begin to think of this already? It is a requirement to think about this. So it's not only a nice to have, it is a need to have under some of the federal regulations that have passed and the federal dollars in order to get them. I am trying, however, to motivate the idea that we should be doing some form of this anyway. And so this is really requiring people to think about these things in a different way. And as this last bullet point says, I think what I'm really hoping, or what Carbon Solutions is hoping, is that we create kind of a standard or expectation of engagement from the very beginning of a project phase. And direct air capture is an especially tenuous place. Well, even sequestration projects are, because we're still often trying to prove the technology before actually deploying it. But if we write our plans correctly and think about engagement correctly, we don't have to have a full-blown engagement strategy, but we can have sort of tendrils of outreach and engagement that are happening scaled to what's happening in the project, so that when it does become a bigger project, you're aware of some of the existing non-technical challenges that you'll inevitably need to face, that you're thinking about from the very beginning of a project. I'm going to pass this over to Jessi next.
Thanks, Erin. So well said. So I think where rubber hits the road, as they say, we've talked a lot about kind of these high level, not philosophical exclusively, but incorporating the ethos of why engagement matters. So what I think becomes often the question, does this actually look like? And this is an answer that is true both within the requirements of a CBP, but also if you are pursuing an engagement strategy outside of being bound to federal funding. So this sort of just outlines the process that we advocate folks take in thinking through cultivating an engagement strategy. And that often begins with something that is sometimes forgotten, the research. And so obviously I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot to pull from in literature and scholarship on theory behind community engagement, but there's also a lot to pull on when we think about researching the community, the social landscape, the stakeholder landscape that a project intends to operate within. And this is often desktop, right? This can happen. We are fortunate to live in the age of the internet where there's a lot of information online. We can access news and media archives. We can access meeting minutes from local planning commissions or county boards or city councils, and all of that information sets a project up to cultivate an engagement strategy that is right-sized and allows you to move into phase two, the actual planning. And one thing to note in this phase of planning is that it's not only planning for engagement, but also communication. And so it goes back to this notion of outreach, right? But ensuring that the relationships that are cultivated have some form of management over the tenure of the project as you foresee it. And as Erin was saying, right, this is going to be dynamic. You may have tendrils before you have a quote unquote full blown, but doing this planning allows you to move forward with a way to execute engagement or your engagement strategy in a really, really mindful way because you've put in the work in advance. You move into implementation for a CBP. That looks like implementation of the engagement plan tailored to the community and stakeholders. But for your project or without, the CBP, it may look slightly different. However, this is when you're going out and actually doing the work. And this is where you want to make sure that you're aligning these considerations to other components of the project schedule, like siting, permit acquisition, construction, ongoing monitoring and maintenance. And then we build into additional phases. So one is evaluation. You just, at this point in time in your hypothetical execution of this, you've just gone through a pretty intensive process. You've done a ton of research on your community and stakeholders, be that what it may for the project as appropriate. You've planned for it, you've executed. Well, how did it go? And here I think we tie back to the point that Erin made at the end, right? How can we create and leverage all of this sort of new work for this industry, though it's not new wholesale, to better inform a standard for how folks can expect to have a relationship with CDR developers and DAC developers in any community, right? If this becomes something very familiar, it's much easier for folks to feel like they have the information necessary to respond, that they know what questions to ask. And that ties into the final stage, which is sort of ongoing efforts, because my favorite, going back to wind and solar, right? We know that so often projects got built, and as things got systemized, the likelihood of a project ownership or even control of maintenance was often handed off to 2 or 3 subsequent developers or owners. And during that stage, there was very little, not to wholesale critique the industry, we just, anecdotally have heard from communities that there was little relationship management there. So it may have been sold and a community didn't know then who to go ask questions to about, I don't know, a deer got stuck in a fence. Like very, not very minor, it's life of deer, but like practical on the ground things where there was no way or easy way for the community to still continue that two-way dialogue, that underpins engagement. And so having an ongoing strategy for efforts beyond the life of the project, even once it's operational. And this also think through obviously things like decommissioning, repowering as it pertains to DAC or CDR in the event that you're beholden to renewable energy power infrastructure, etc. So that, I say that's all, it was kind of a lot, but those are the 5 sort of steps we think through in cultivating a tailored community engagement strategy for a project or technology. And this is not all that different from what I just said, right? But obviously within those things, there are very specific deliverables that we provide. So Carbon Solutions has what we're calling a community engagement toolkit. The pre-work, research, planning, implementation, and evaluation, as well as ongoing efforts are all things that we provide support on. What this looks like in substance is often support grant writing for all the plans that Erin mentioned. We've supported proposal development. There's also a lot of really cool software that some very technical people that I am proud to be able to say I get to work with have developed to help think through how we can cite these projects most efficaciously, both from a technological perspective, but also starting to integrate some of those social and other potentially financial considerations. And then having some scoping conversations, as well as additional research on funding opportunities. We then move into the 5 phases that I outlined, where in research, you're doing a lot of the desktop work to prepare yourself and your team and your project to be in community and to have engagement that is informed by the information available to us, right? Like it's due diligence is very helpful. And then move into planning, where you pursue an engagement plan and strategy. You can leverage insights from the stakeholder engagement work that was done, and then you implement. And this can look and will look a lot of different ways. I think to iterate here, this says public engagement events in bold, and I regret that because that's not all engagement is. Engagement can look and should look very different, and be mindful of what's appropriate for your project. Engagement does not equal, for any programmers, exclamation mark equals a town hall. It is and can be so much more than that. And thinking through other communication tactics around social media, having an online platform, having a narrative for your project, or supporting the broader narrative for the technology that you're deploying, and then evaluation and ongoing efforts. That's still very high level, and so I'm going to hand it over to Erin to talk about what you could be doing.
Thanks. So in doing everything that Jessi had just said, which are all things that we're kind of doing day in and day out, it's what would be most helpful if we were to write a proposal right now and somebody said, what should we be doing? And I have some steps. Many of you may be sort of in the before the proposal step right now. I'm sure this is common practice to a whole bunch of folks, but determine your project goals. This sounds really basic, but do you want everybody to know your name, or do you want to have a great technology? Do you want something in the middle? Figure out where those are and let your goals drive everything else. else. You are probably already meeting with state and regional officials or people. Write them down. When you come to the proposal, we need to write who you've met with and what outreach you've done. And if you start writing things down, it makes it a lot easier for everyone. Figure out your project schedule. When will someone see a thing, and then back up your engagement before then? Will they see something in 6 months, in a year? Figure out what those things are and communicate to anybody who's especially working on community benefits. Does somebody in your group have a passion? Do you love outreach? Are you going to be in an area with tribes? Do you need investors? Your community benefits plan should not be a standalone plan that does not help any of your technical work. These two things should be married, and the better idea that you have of what your project goals are, the better a community benefits plan can serve your overall project at every stage of development. If you need letters of support, that can go back with the documenting and then starting to establish those relationships. And then also take a look at the CGES tool or the EPA tool in order to see what disadvantaged communities or Justice 4D communities might be in your area. It's a really simple way to do some due diligence. As you move from before the proposal work into during the proposal, these are, again, just a smattering of things that don't always come up. Think about your strengths and the partner strengths. Who should be doing something? Should you be doing outreach? Should you pay somebody to do outreach? There's no right answers, but thinking about this. Do you really just need to know what the laws are? Maybe that's a more important place to put your money and time. Who's going to be the face of your specific project if you're a DAC company? Do you have someone yet? Do you want to be behind the scenes? But it's not too early to start thinking about that. Will you hire someone to be in your local area? You'll need to do it at some point. But if you get this proposal, is that when it happens? Or do you want somebody to be a consistent face as you're doing letters of support? One of the things that I'm going to say that Jessi just mentioned is this continuing of outreach, especially for tribes or people who are disadvantaged communities that nobody's ever talked to before. The first time that somebody talks to them is writing a proposal or getting a letter of support, and then sometimes they never hear from anyone again. So start cultivating these relationships and put a calendar reminder every 6 months to follow up with whatever local group or university that it is, just so that you can have this ongoing relationship building. And then decide what your non-technical challenges are and see how this can be incorporated into your work. During the project, it's a lot of the things that Jessi just mentioned. It's doing the work, evaluating the project, and then going forward. That is sort of covered in the last part. As the project is finished, think about your exit strategy. If you're not going to be invested in here, how much work do you want to put in this? It's helpful to give a short thought about this now, especially as you're thinking about hiring people for projects going forward or investing in the local community. We don't want broken promises, and so promising less to begin with if you're likely to go out of this area if you can't demonstrate your technology is something that's important to consider about. If it is successful, however, start thinking about how you need to hire people. Will there be labor agreements? Does your state have labor agreements? If you're in California, 100%. If you're in Wyoming, maybe not. Is there other ways that you may invest with local groups, direct support of schools or nonprofits? What, again, is now that you're getting a little bigger, what are your priorities of your organization, and how can you see this going forward? As the project scales, we see a lot of companies imagining looking like utilities or any other place that is a lot more money and a lot bigger and has more consistent relationship with local folks. This will mean an extension of your network. Do you need to join business organizations if you haven't already? Do you need to have a strategy for going public? Do you need to talk to local newspapers? What are some of the things that you need to do as you go to the next level? And then as federal projects, if these are going to continue to be required, having internal ideas about how you want labor agreements to look or community agreements, which ones of these are important to you and which ones of these are relevant to the local folks, are things that we think are really important to consider. Next slide, please. So just as a long presentation, what would you prioritize? There's lots of different ways to define community. Think about it in regulatory and local space and all of the kind of hierarchies that Jessi showed earlier. Community benefits plans require equitable project development. They change sometimes more than we'd like if we're writing proposals, but the big idea should go through all of these. And it's a mix of social science, public health, PR, science communication. It is not one thing, and it is not one thing throughout the entire project. So just know that we all have to be flexible in what community benefits plans are and how this work is operationalized. For anybody thinking, with a recap of the last slide, it's never early to start your engagement strategy, but it should be aligned to what your goals and your project size is, your technical readiness level. And finally, CVPs and their labor agreements, we can write this a few different times, will continue to evolve, as they should, as the technology becomes more ready, as communities get more used to this, as other things happen. These are going to evolve, and we just have to be ready to evolve with them. So I think our last slide is our conclusion slide. I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat.
Thank you, Jessi and Erin. I thought I would kick off a question here and give some folks a little time to throw something else in the chat. But I'm curious, what have been some of the most challenging aspects of community engagement with your experience so far, and how have you addressed these challenges?
I can kick off. I know Erin has, I think we both have examples. For me personally, I think one of the hardest things has been relationship management in the age that we're in, which is often remote, it's often hybrid, and there was historically, I think, a bit of a mismatch in what the expectation for building a relationship really looks like in engagement, because it does involve time, it involves consistency, it involves wanting to be in that relationship at times for more than just the project that you're developing, and so finding the balance, but also pushing to ensure that there is space for that relationship building, has been difficult. But I think we've seen success in having open conversation about that need with folks. I will give a pat on the back to the folks at DOE who are overseeing a lot of the federal projects, have been so responsive to hearing feedback from the project applicants and awardees in how and when things are difficult, and when things are when there's opportunity to improve processes to benefit everyone. And then I also think, like Erin was saying, it's as simple as like setting a reminder on your calendar to make sure that you're following up with folks, because it's really easy for all of us to get lost in the day-to-day and forget to do that. There's so much more. That was just one. Erin, do you have examples?
I think the only thing that I would say, especially for people new to this space, is figure out who is best at communicating what information, and it may not be who you think it is. Engineers have roles, scientists have roles, communication folks have roles, and it's important to be responsive to the needs of different audiences, and that may mean that lots of different people are involved in engagement in different ways than they would have expected.
All right, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Jessi.
I was just going to say, in lieu of another question, I think also to underscore something that Erin said that I thought was really articulate and relevant at the end about how when you have communities in place, you want to make sure that the thought that I had was really, really great in what you said, Erin, and I absolutely lost my train of thought. So Rachel, go ahead.
It was because I cut you off. You were rolling, but anyway, if there are no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you everyone for joining us today. The follow-up webinar should be posted on YouTube within the next day or two. So thank you again to our presenters, and everybody have a wonderful day.